The desert sun cast long, unforgiving shadows across the dusty road when Thea Calloway first appeared with her basket of roses, a splash of crimson against the parched landscape of Sweetwater, Texas. The year was 1876, and while most folks were still rebuilding their lives after the war, Thea had found her small rebellion against poverty in cultivating beauty, where it seemed impossible to grow. Every morning before dawn, Thea would rise from her small bed in the back room of her aunt's modest home on the outskirts of town. She tended her miracle of a garden, a patch of earth that somehow, through her stubborn determination and careful hands, produced roses more vibrant than any others for 100 miles. By sunrise, she would be stationed at the bend in the road where travelers first caught sight of Sweetwater, her simple wooden stand adorned with fresh blooms wrapped in scraps of newspaper. The first time Yates Yarbrough rode past, he nearly fell off his horse. It wasn't the roses that startled him, it was the woman selling them. She stood straight-backed despite the heat, her chestnut hair escaping a practical braid, skin kissed by the sun, and eyes the deep green of river moss. Something about her stillness amid the swirling dust made him pull his horse to a stop. "How much?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended after days of hard riding. 10 cents apiece, she replied, meeting his gaze directly, no trace of the demure shyness most young women affected around men they didn't know. He bought one single red rose, fumbling with the coins in his calloused hand. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the carefully wrapped stem. He noticed a small cut on her index finger, likely from a thorn. The details stayed with him as he rode into town. "Your name?" he asked softly, his hat already in his hands, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I'm just the rose girl," she answered, turning away to arrange her remaining flowers. The next day, Yates returned, and the day after that. Each day he bought a single rose, and each day he asked her name in that same gentle voice. Each day she refused to give it. Thea had her reasons for keeping to herself. At 22, she'd already weathered more than her fair share of disappointments. Her father had abandoned them when she was just 8 years old, leaving her mother to scrape by until consumption took her 4 years later. Then it was off to her aunt's house in Sweetwater, where she worked from sunup to sundown to earn her keep. The roses had started as a necessity, a way to contribute to the household, but had become her sanctuary. Each bloom felt like a small victory against the harshness of life. She wasn't about to share pieces of herself with some cowboy passing through, no matter how his soft questions lingered in her mind each night as she fell asleep. Yates had his own story. At 26, he'd arrived in Sweetwater to take up a position as foreman at the Rockingham Ranch outside town. The war had taken his father, and his mother had remarried a banker in St. Louis, who had little use for a stepson more comfortable with horses than ledger books. With nothing but his saddle, his rifle, and a reputation as a hard worker who could gentle even the wildest Mustang, he'd made his way west, determined to build something of his own. 2 weeks after he first stopped at Thea's stand, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west. Massive clouds boiled on the horizon as Thea hurriedly gathered her unsold roses. The first fat raindrops were already splashing in the dust when Yates appeared on his bay gelding. "Let me help you," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "I can manage," she insisted, but the wind chose that moment to gust, scattering loose petals across the road. "I'm sure you can," he replied, already gathering her small table. "But that doesn't mean you have to." The rain came harder, and without further argument, Thea allowed him to secure her table and baskets to his horse. He offered her his hand and helped her mount behind him. The storm unleashed its fury as they rode toward town, thunder cracking overhead as lightning split the darkened sky. "Where to?" he shouted over his shoulder. "The yellow house past the church," she called back, her arms tentatively circling his waist. By the time they reached her aunt's home, they were both soaked to the skin. Thea's aunt, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, took one look at the bedraggled pair on her doorstep and ushered them inside. "Thea Elizabeth Calloway, what on earth were you thinking staying out with a storm coming?" she fussed, already moving to put on a pot of coffee. Yates turned to Thea with the beginnings of a smile. "Thea," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "Don't look so pleased with yourself," she said, but there was no real anger in her tone. "Yates Yarbrough," he offered in return, extending his hand. "Pleasure to properly meet you, Miss Calloway." That evening, sitting at her aunt's sturdy kitchen table with the rain drumming on the roof, Thea learned that Yates wasn't just passing through. He told her about his position at the Rocking Inn, about his plans to save enough to buy his own piece of land someday. She found herself sharing stories of her roses, how she'd learned to grow them from an old Mexican woman who'd lived next door to them in San Antonio, how each color had its own temperament. "Red ones are the strongest," she explained. "They can take the heat better than the others." "Is that why you sell mostly red?" he asked. "That and they're what people want to buy. Red means something to folks. What does it mean to you?" His eyes, a warm brown that reminded her of fertile soil, held genuine interest. She hesitated. "Promise that even in hard places, beautiful things can grow if you're stubborn enough to tend them." When the rain finally subsided, Yates reluctantly rose to leave. At the door, he turned back to her. "I'll be by tomorrow for my rose," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "I'll have one waiting," she replied. True to his word, Yates came the next day and every day that followed. Sometimes he would stop for just a moment. Other times he would linger, telling her about his day or asking about hers. He began bringing her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry he'd found in the general store, a small knife with a pearl handle for trimming your roses. Word spread through Sweetwater about the quiet cowboy who bought a rose each day from the pretty girl at the edge of town. Some found it romantic. Others whispered that Thea was foolish to encourage the attention. What did anyone really know about this Yarbrough fellow anyway? Thea paid the gossip no mind. For the first time since her mother died, she felt something unfurling inside her chest, delicate and tender as new growth. She caught herself watching the road each morning, listening for the familiar sound of hoofbeats. In early September, Yates didn't come. Thea told herself it didn't matter, that he had never made promises beyond buying her roses, but the day stretched endlessly before her. By sunset, she had convinced herself that his interest had finally waned, that perhaps he had found some other diversion in town. The next morning, she almost didn't set up her stand. Only habit and necessity drove her to the roadside with her basket of fresh-cut roses. She was arranging them when the sound of a wagon rather than a single horse made her look up. Yates pulled the team to a halt beside her stand. His face was bruised, a dark purple spreading beneath his left eye, and he moved stiffly as he climbed down from the seat. "What happened to you?" she asked, reaching toward him before catching herself. "Rustlers," he said simply. "Caught them trying to take some of the Rocking Inn stock." "There was a fight. Did you catch them?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "We did. Sheriff's got them locked up now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his money. "One rose, please." She handed him the flower, noticing the split skin on his knuckles. "You should have those looked at," she said softly. "They'll heal." His fingers closed carefully around the stem. "I missed seeing you yesterday. The simple admission warmed her more than she cared to admit. "I noticed you didn't come by. Did you miss me too?" There was a vulnerability in his question that made her heart catch. "Perhaps I did," she allowed, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his face despite the bruising. As autumn approached, bringing relief from the summer heat, Yates began arriving with coffee on cooler mornings. He would sit with her on a small bench he'd built beside her stand, talking about everything and nothing as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Thea working on mending or embroidery between customers, Yates whittling small figures from wood that he would leave for her when he departed. One crisp October morning, Yates arrived with an unusual request. "Come riding with me on Sunday," he said. "I want to show you something." Thea hesitated. Riding alone with a man, even one she'd come to know as well as Yates, would set tongues wagging all over town. As if reading her thoughts, he quickly added, "Your aunt is welcome to come along. I've borrowed a buckboard from the ranch." Thought we might have a picnic. When Sunday arrived, Thea was surprised when her usually strict aunt not only gave permission but declined to accompany them. "I've known Yates's employer for 20 years, she said. "If Mr. Mitchell trusts him with his ranch, I can trust him with my niece for an afternoon. Besides," she added with a rare twinkle in her eye, "I've seen how he looks at you. That boy's intentions couldn't be more proper if he tried." The day was perfect, the sky a deep, endless blue. Yates drove them east out of town, following a creek that wound through stands of cottonwoods now turned golden. After about an hour, he turned off the main trail onto a narrower path that climbed gradually upward. "Where are we going?" Thea asked, curiosity finally overcoming her. "You'll see," was all he would say, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. The trail crested a small rise, and suddenly the land opened before them, a sheltered valley, with the creek running through its center. Wild grass rippled in the breeze, and at the far end a small cabin stood nestled against a grove of trees. "What is this place?" Thea asked as Yates halted the horses. "Mine," he said simply. "Or it will be once the papers are finalized next week. 40 acres. Not much compared to the big ranches, but it's good land with water year-round." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. As they walked toward the cabin, he pointed out his plans where he would build corrals for horses, where the garden would go, how he would expand the cabin in time. "It needs work," he acknowledged as they reached the simple structure. "But the roof's sound and the walls are sturdy. Come spring, I'll be able to move in and start proper." Thea moved to the doorway, peering inside at the single room with its stone fireplace and rough plank floor. It was spare but clean, with a sense of possibility that stirred something inside her. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. They spread their picnic beneath a broad oak tree with a view of the entire valley. As they ate, Yates spoke more openly than he ever had about his hopes for the future, the horses he wanted to raise, the life he imagined building here. "I've been saving every penny since I was 16, he told her. "Worked cattle drives, broke horses, took whatever honest work I could find. There were times I didn't think I'd ever have enough. But now you do," she said, admiring the determination that had brought him this far. "Almost," he replied. His eyes, when they met hers, held something she couldn't quite name. "There's still one thing missing." Before she could ask what he meant, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single small pearl. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, his voice suddenly rougher. "My mother sent it to me last month when I wrote to her about," he paused, took a deep breath. "About you." Thea couldn't breathe. She stared at the ring, then at Yates's face, so earnest and hopeful and terrified all at once. "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, "and I'm not asking for an answer today, but I wanted you to see this place, to understand what I'm working toward, and to know that I can't imagine building any of it without you." "Yates," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just think about it," he said quickly. "That's all I'm asking. Think about whether you could see yourself here, with me." The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached her aunt's house, Yates helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the door. Before she could go inside, he pulled a rose from inside his coat, one of her own, but pressed and preserved between the pages of a book. "I've kept every one," he admitted, "from the first day." She accepted the pressed rose, cradling it in her palm. "I'll think about it," she promised. "Your question?" He nodded, seeming to understand that she needed time. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, and it sounded like a promise of much more. That night, Thea couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, turning the preserved rose over in her fingers, thinking about the little valley, the cabin waiting to become a home, and the man who had carried her flowers with him each day since they met. Morning found her at her stand earlier than usual, waiting. When Yates appeared, right on schedule, something in her face must have given her away, because he dismounted before he even reached her, crossing the remaining distance on foot with long, urgent strides. "Thea?" he questioned, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. She held out a single rose to him, a white one, not red. "Do you know what white roses mean?" she asked. He shook his head, taking the flower from her with careful fingers. "New beginnings," she said. And yes, for a moment he didn't seem to understand. Then his face broke into a smile so radiant it seemed to outshine the rising sun. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she confirmed. "I'll marry you, Yates Yarbrough." He let out a whoop that startled his horse, then caught himself, glancing around to see if anyone had witnessed his outburst. Seeing no one on the still empty road, he stepped closer to her, one hand gently framing her face. "May I?" he asked, his voice hushed. In answer, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise. When they parted, she could feel the heat in her cheeks, but couldn't bring herself to regret her boldness. "I should speak to your aunt," he said, suddenly remembering propriety. "She already knows I was considering your offer," Thea admitted. "She told me last night that she's never seen me happier than these past months." They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church in Sweetwater. Thea carried a bouquet of her own roses, red for love, white for new beginnings, and a single pink bloom in the center for happiness. Her aunt had sewn her a simple but beautiful dress, and Mrs. Mitchell from the ranch had lent her a lace veil that had been in her family for generations. Yates stood tall at the altar in a new suit, his face solemn until the moment Thea appeared at the back of the church. The smile that broke across his features then was worth every hardship she had ever endured. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward. Even those who had whispered about the impropriety of their courtship seemed won over by the obvious devotion between the new Mr. and Mrs. Yarbrough. They danced under the stars until the musicians grew tired, and when they finally rode away in Yates's wagon, decorated with roses and ribbons by the local children, they were showered with good wishes and handfuls of wheat for prosperity. They didn't go directly to their valley. The cabin wasn't ready yet for a bride, so they took rooms at the hotel in town while Yates finished the necessary improvements. Each day, Thea still sold her roses, but now Yates would come at the end of the day to help her pack up and walk her home. In November, an early winter storm blew in from the north, bringing freezing temperatures that threatened Thea's roses. Yates worked through the night helping her cover the plants and build windbreaks to protect them. They managed to save most of the garden, but the cold snap was a harsh reminder of how precarious their livelihood could be. "We need a proper greenhouse," Yates declared the next morning, surveying the damage. "Something solid that can protect your roses year-round." "That would cost more than we can afford right now," Thea said pragmatically. "The cabin comes first." But Yates was determined. He began taking extra work breaking horses for neighboring ranches, saving every penny toward building materials. When the owner of the mercantile mentioned he was looking for someone to drive supply wagons to outlying homesteads once a week, Thea volunteered, using her earnings to contribute to their building fund. By Christmas, they had enough to purchase the glass and lumber they would need come spring. They celebrated the holiday in their nearly finished cabin, with a small pine tree Yates had cut and decorated with paper stars Thea had folded. They exchanged modest gifts: a new hat for Yates, a set of hairpins for Thea, but their real present to each other was the home they were creating together. The winter passed in a blur of hard work and quiet evenings by the fire. Thea discovered that Yates had a beautiful singing voice and loved when he would bring out his harmonica after supper. He found that she had a talent for storytelling, weaving tales from her childhood or inventing new ones that made him laugh or sit in rapt attention. In February, a letter arrived from Yates's mother, announcing her intention to visit in the spring. "She wants to meet you," Yates explained. "And to see this place that's finally made me settle down. Will she approve of me?" Thea couldn't help asking, suddenly anxious about meeting the woman who had raised this man she had come to love so deeply. "She'll adore you," Yates assured her. "How could she not?" As winter reluctantly gave way to spring, they moved permanently to their valley. Thea transplanted her most precious roses to their new home, creating a garden near the cabin, while Yates and several friends from town constructed the greenhouse he had promised her. It was a simple structure, but to Thea, it represented a level of security she had never known: protection for the flowers that had sustained her through so many difficult years. Yates's mother arrived in April, a handsome woman with her son's kind eyes and direct manner. She took one look at the cabin, the new greenhouse, and the way Thea and Yates moved around each other with such natural harmony, and declared herself satisfied. "You've done well for yourself, son," she said on her second evening with them, "both in your choice of land and your choice of wife." Thea felt herself blush at the compliment but was pleased by the approval. That night, after Yates's mother had retired to the small guest room they had prepared, Thea and Yates sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky. "Are you happy?" Yates asked suddenly, his arm warm around her shoulders. Thea leaned into him, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said finally. "Happier than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then I've accomplished everything I set out to do when I first saw you with your roses by the road." In May, as her roses burst into their first spectacular bloom in their new location, Thea made a discovery that filled her with equal parts terror and joy. When she told Yates that evening that they would be welcoming a child in the winter, he lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, his laughter echoing across their valley. "Are you pleased then?" she asked, somewhat unnecessarily given his reaction. "Pleased doesn't begin to cover it," he assured her, his hand gently covering her still flat stomach. "Our family is growing just like your garden." As the summer progressed, so did Thea's condition. She continued to sell roses in town, though now Yates insisted on driving her there and back each day. Her customers noticed her changing shape and offered congratulations along with their coins. The women of Sweetwater, many of whom had initially been skeptical of her hasty marriage, now welcomed her fully into their circle, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. In August, disaster struck. A grass fire, started by lightning miles away, swept toward their valley with frightening speed. Yates was away delivering horses to a buyer when the first smoke appeared on the horizon. Thea, alone at the cabin, had to make quick decisions. She hitched their wagon herself, loaded their most precious possessions, and led their livestock to the creek, where the green vegetation and water might offer some protection. Then, against all logic, she returned to the greenhouse. Inside were the mother plants of all her rose varieties, the original stock she had nurtured for years. She couldn't bear to lose them. Working feverishly, she dug up the most important plants and loaded them into buckets of damp earth. The smoke was thickening, burning her eyes and throat when she heard hoofbeats pounding toward the cabin. Yates burst into the greenhouse, his face streaked with soot, eyes wild with fear. "Thea, thank God," he grabbed her arm. "We have to go now." "The roses," she began, but he was already lifting the buckets. "I know. But you first." They barely made it to the creek before the fire crested the ridge above their cabin. For hours, they stood in knee-deep water, Thea cradling her precious plants, Yates keeping their frightened horses calm as the fire roared past on either side of the creek bed. The heat was intense, the smoke suffocating, but the water protected them from the worst of it. When it was finally over, they emerged to survey the damage. The cabin, thanks to its stone foundation and the cleared area Yates had maintained around it, had survived, though the roof would need repairs. The greenhouse was intact but would require new glass in several panels. The garden, however, was gone, reduced to ash along with most of the grazing land. Thea stood amid the devastation, her hands protectively curved around her growing belly. "We'll rebuild," she said with quiet determination. "We still have each other and the core of my roses." She looked up at her husband, seeing the exhaustion and relief warring in his face. "That's all we need to start again." Yates pulled her close, his cheek resting on the top of her head. "You're right," he agreed. "As long as we're together, we can face anything." The fire proved to be a blessing in disguise. News of their close call spread, and neighbors they barely knew arrived to help repair the damage. The Mitchells from the Rocking M sent men with lumber and tools. Women from town brought food and helped Thea replant her garden with the salvaged roses and new cuttings donated by sympathetic gardeners from as far away as San Antonio. By October, their home was not only restored but improved. The repaired greenhouse was larger than before, with better ventilation and a small heating stove for the coldest nights. The garden was beginning to show green shoots where there had been only ash. And most miraculously, the fire had cleared a field of dense brush to reveal a natural spring they hadn't known existed, a source of water that would make expanding their garden easier than they'd ever hoped. "See," Thea said one evening as they walked the perimeter of their land, her hand resting on her now prominent belly. "Even the worst fire leaves room for new growth." Yates laced his fingers through hers. "You taught me that," he said. "With your roses by the road, beauty from the hardest circumstances." Their daughter was born in January, a healthy child with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined green eyes. They named her Rose. Of course, there could be no other name for the child, who represented the culmination of their unlikely love story. By the following spring, Thea's roses were again the finest in the county. She still sold them in town, but now from a proper shop Yates had helped her open on the main street. Rose would sleep in a basket behind the counter, surrounded by the sweet scent of her namesake flowers, while her mother arranged bouquets for weddings and courting couples and grieving widows alike. Yates, divided his time between his growing horse business and helping with the roses. He never tired of watching Thea's hands move among the blooms, as careful and loving as they were when they cradled their daughter. And every day, without fail, he would select a single rose, sometimes red, sometimes white, occasionally pink or yellow, and ask softly for his wife's name, as if hearing it for the first time. "Thea Yarbrough," she would always answer, a smile playing at her lips. And he would lean across the counter to kiss her, the rose pressed gently between them, a reminder of the day a lonely cowboy had stopped to buy a flower from a girl with secrets in her eyes and soil beneath her fingernails. 5 years after they met, on the anniversary of that first encounter, Yates brought Thea back to the spot by the road where she had once kept her humble stand. In its place stood a small stone marker he had commissioned without her knowledge. "Here bloomed the first rose of our love," Thea read aloud, her voice catching. "Oh, Yates, too sentimental?" he asked, suddenly unsure. She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. "Perfect," she whispered, "like everything you've given me." Their second daughter was born later that year, followed by a son 2 years after. Their valley flourished, becoming known throughout the region for both its fine horses and its extraordinary roses. Thea developed new varieties, naming them after her children and the milestones of their life together. But no matter how successful they became, no matter how many years passed, Yates never forgot to ask her name each day, soft and reverent, as if it were the most precious word in his vocabulary. And Thea never tired of answering, grateful beyond measure for the man who had seen past her thorns to the promise blooming beneath.